In 1952, deep inside the psychological arms race of the Cold War, the U.S. began exploring new forms of mind control, consciousness disassembly, and biospiritual reprogramming. The public would later hear fragments under names like MKUltra or Project Artichoke. But Project Medulla was never meant to be found. Named for the medulla oblongata, the brainstem, the gateway between body and mind. It wasn't about interrogation. It was about remapping reality perception. And it needed two things. 1. A controlled spiritual environment. 2. A test population with high belief susceptibility. They didn't want just subjects. They wanted believers. We're better than a religious hospital. And so the CIA, working through the Department of Defense's Psychological Operations Command, embedded specialists into spiritual institutions across the U.S. St. Thomas was one of them. The Faith Healing Wing wasn't just a ministry. It was a biocognitive laboratory. DNA, the 6 shadow doctors. Their real names are scrubbed, but we have fragments from their code names, tracked through redacted surveillance logs. Dr. Griffin, specialist in electromagnetic induction therapy and deep hypnotic suggestion. Dr. Veritas, designed the light entrainment sequence used in the stained glass chamber. Dr. AVA, oversaw linguistic diffusion, implanted spiritual mantras through sleep whispers. Dr. Kane, an interrogator turned priest, expert in guilt-triggered submission. Dr. Teorque, developed the acoustics in room 311. Dr. Harold, the last one seen alive, photographed in 1981 walking into a closed-off chapel during a lunar eclipse, carrying what appeared to be a medical relic. Their goal wasn't. In one image, 5 patients lie on the floor surrounding a physician in white robes, not a lab coat, but liturgical garb, arms raised, reciting something while holding a black object the size of a human skull. What object? Enhanced scans revealed faint inscriptions on its surface, a countdown sequence in Roman numerals, ending in 67. And in the background of every photo, the windows glow. Not from the sun, from within. Each photo was timestamped at 3:11 a.m. Room 311's number. Coincidence? The Vatican claimed the photos were hoaxes, but metadata showed they were taken with a discontinued military issue like a camera, one only issued to diplomatic field observers during black site investigations. Why would a spiritual wellness assistant have access to that? Unless she wasn't just staff. Unless Magdala was placed there, watching, waiting, until the ritual repeated too many times to ignore. In her final leak, she included one sentence, typed in red ink on brittle onion skin paper. They don't heal them. They prepare them. Each one aligned to the sky, so the old wound can open again. What wound? They called her Magdala. Not her real name, just the code name she used when she began leaking evidence in 1997. She had worked at St. Thomas for 16 years. Officially, assistant coordinator of spiritual wellness. Unofficially, she was present during every faith-healing procedure in Ward 3 for over a decade. She wasn't just a witness. She was a participant until something snapped. The photographs were mailed anonymously to 3 journalists and 1 former Vatican investigator. No note, no fingerprints, just a symbol on the envelope, a spiral with a dot at its center. Inside were 11 photographs, each stamped with dates that aligned exactly with rare celestial events, lunar eclipses, equinoxes, and transits of Mercury. But the content? Patients arranged in sacred geometric patterns. Circles, pentagrams, a shape known in occult math as the Metatron gate, used in ancient rituals believed to amplify the transmission of soul energy. They weren't strapped down. They were positioned. Hands over heart, eyes covered, chest exposed. Every hospital has utility corridors, but St. Thomas had a tunnel no architect would admit to. There's no blueprint, no access key, no maintenance schedule, and yet it exists. It was first discovered through artwork. Between 1938 and 1954, over 24 patients in Ward 3, most of them diagnosed with schizophrenia or religious delusions, began compulsively drawing the same thing. A long, narrow passage lined with torches and marked by a series of symbols that repeated like a chant. Each drawing placed the tunnel beneath the south wall of the chapel, angled downward, spiraling beneath the hospital's lowest level. The doctors called it mass hallucination. But in 1965, during a routine pipe excavation beneath that same wall, workers broke into a bricked-over corridor, 10 feet wide. 27 feet long, before it vanished into a collapse of stone and soil. It wasn't empty. The walls were painted, not with plaster, not with ink, but with blood compound, traced in intricate glyphs no language department could identify. One anthropologist called it pre-protoscript, a written system so old it predates Sumerian cuneiform. The characters appear to shift when viewed at different angles. Some describe it as liquid geometry, more symbolic than linguistic. And at the deepest accessible point, they found a slab. Not concrete, not stone, flesh stone. A calcified organic compound, smooth as marble and warm to the touch, though no heat source was nearby. Etched into its surface was a spiral of names, 67 in total. The same number of patients who never recovered. But the chilling part? 3 names hadn't yet occurred. Patients still alive. Patients who would vanish exactly 1 year later. So who built the tunnel? There's no record. No construction logs. The church denies its existence. But one internal memo, leaked in 1988 from a Vatican investigative team, states plainly, "We believe the structure predates the hospital. The hospital was placed atop it, by design. It was called the Sanctum of Recovery, a small marble chapel tucked inside the eastern wing of St. Thomas. Meant for prayer, solace, confession, but no one ever left it feeling lighter. The chapel was acoustically wrong. Engineers brought in to assess it for structural issues in 1958 couldn't explain it. Whispers carried across the room, yet voices at full volume vanished in the air, like something was eating sound. And then there was room 311, the confessional booth. It looked ordinary. Mahogany trim, velvet curtain, brass grill. But every priest assigned to it over the years either requested reassignment or disappeared. One, Father Delancey, was institutionalized after reportedly refusing to leave the booth for 3 days straight. He kept muttering, "I never said those words, but I heard them in my own voice." You see, room 311 didn't record confessions. It replayed them. To others, patients began reporting a strange phenomenon, dreams that weren't theirs, thoughts they couldn't place, memories of pain from people they'd never met. It was as if the booth absorbed the confessions of one and broadcast them, distorted, fragmented, repurposed into the minds of others. And the voice? It was always familiar. A nurse once described it as your father's voice or a dead friend, only deeper, slower, as if it was learning your tone and testing it. But this wasn't just psychological. A declassified memo from 1971, sent from the Office of Naval Research to an unnamed bishop, describes non-local auditory imprint phenomena occurring at St. Thomas. Their conclusion? The chamber generates recursive sonic fields, not echoes, reflections of intention. Reflections of intention. What happens when the place designed to absolve your sins begins replaying your darkness to others? What happens when guilt isn't released, but multiplied, dispersed across a network of wounded minds already stripped of defense? You create a hive of pain, a sanctuary of looping. Stained glass is supposed to tell holy stories, parables in color, light made divine. But the windows at St. Thomas don't depict saints, not in the way we recognize them. Above Ward 3's main corridor is a series of 13 stained glass panels, each precisely arranged along the southern wall, where morning sun strikes hardest. At first glance, they appear biblical: a lamb, a chalice, a shepherd, a serpent. But upon closer study, using ultraviolet tracing, researchers found something disturbing. None of the windows match canonical scripture. In fact, they don't align with any recognized Christian story. Instead, each panel is encoded with layered symbology, mirror-image script, backwards Hebrew, runic overlays, and something stranger. A ciphered alphabet matching no known language. It repeats a phrase across the glass in spiraling patterns. Through pain, obedience. Through obedience, release. Every single patient in Ward 3 reported nightmares involving light, blinding, colored light. Some claimed to see faces in the patterns. One man, a former codebreaker for the Navy, suffered a breakdown after 12 nights under that glass. His final words. The glass prays back. Let that sink in. They weren't just decorating the hospital. They were broadcasting, programming, even. Dr. Alena Sorrell, a linguist hired to catalog the patterns, identified something terrifying: entrainment frequencies. The colors and shapes triggered neural synchronization, similar to what happens during deep meditation or hypnosis. But instead of calm, Patients entered compliant trance states. No resistance, no rebellion, just submission to the voice of whoever stood at the pulpit or bed. These weren't windows. They were psychological tools, weaponized to override spiritual autonomy. Crafted not by priests or artists, but technicians in religious disguise. The lead signature at the corner of each window doesn't belong to any stained glass guild. It's a symbol, 3 inverted crowns STA. Ward 3 was the epicenter. The faith-healing ward. The site of the miracles. But when city engineers scanned the hospital foundation in 1974, they found something the church refused to acknowledge, and the hospital tried to bury literally. Under the bedrock of Ward 3, beneath the pipes, the tiles, the hollow walls, was a burial pit. Not a cemetery, not an ossuary. A pit. And the bones inside? They weren't aligned. They weren't blessed. They were broken, stacked like fuel, with evidence of deliberate scorching. Long bones cracked mid-shaft. Skulls punctured and marked with glyphs. Carbon dating put them at early 14th century. But here's the twist. The stone lining that pit? It wasn't quarried locally. It came from over 3,000 miles away, from a ruined monastery outside Carcassonne, France. A site excommunicated by Pope Clement V in 1312 under sealed bull for heretical rites and communion with the dead. That monastery, known as Sancta Lympha, was said to be experimenting with resonant architecture, constructing sacred spaces that could channel human suffering into ecstatic states. Ecstatic, not redemptive, not purifying, just intensified. Those monks vanished. The Vatican razed the structure. The Church declared the land unholy unto dust. And yet, the stones reappeared. How? Records show that in 1890, 1 year before the official founding of St. Thomas, a freighter under false registry docked in New York with unmarked cargo and no manifest. It offloaded 11 crates of consecrated limestone. That cargo was signed for by Elias Corvin. You remember that name. The man with no medical license, no birth record, and no grave. Those same stones formed the foundation of Ward 3. Some even lined the prayer alcoves. And when surveyed with ground-penetrating radar, engineers noticed an anomaly. A low-frequency hum emanating from beneath the stonework, an ambient vibration. Not mechanical. Not geological. Intentional. One researcher, Dr. Isaac Mern, said it best in his. Ward 3 was the epicenter. The faith-healing ward. The site of the miracles. But when city engineers scanned the hospital foundation in 1974, they found something the church refused to acknowledge, and the hospital tried to bury literally. Under the bedrock of Ward 3, beneath the pipes, the tiles, the hollow walls, was a burial pit. Not a cemetery, not an ossuary. A pit. And the bones inside? They weren't aligned. They weren't blessed. They were broken, stacked like fuel, with evidence of deliberate scorching. Long bones cracked mid-shaft. Skulls punctured and marked with glyphs. Carbon dating put them at early 14th century. But here's the twist. The stone lining that pit? It wasn't quarried locally. It came from over 3,000 miles away, from a ruined monastery outside Carcassonne, France. A site excommunicated by Pope Clement V in 1312 under sealed bull for heretical rites and communion with the dead. That monastery, known as Sancta Lympha, was said to be experimenting with resonant architecture, constructing sacred spaces that could channel human suffering into ecstatic states. Ecstatic, not redemptive, not purifying, just intensified. Those monks vanished. The Vatican razed the structure. The Church declared the land unholy unto dust. And yet, the stones reappeared. How? Records show that in 1890, 1 year before the official founding of St. Thomas, a freighter under false registry docked in New York with unmarked cargo and no manifest. It offloaded 11 crates of consecrated limestone. That cargo was signed for by Elias Corvin. You remember that name. The man with no medical license, no birth record, and no grave. Those same stones formed the foundation of Ward 3. Some even lined the prayer alcoves. And when surveyed with ground-penetrating radar, engineers noticed an anomaly. A low-frequency hum emanating from beneath the stonework, an ambient vibration. Not mechanical. Not geological. Intentional. One researcher, Dr. Isaac Mern, said it best in his. Her name was Lillian Harker, age 29, referred to St. Thomas for nervous affliction and spiritual disassociation. Translation? Severe anxiety and postpartum depression. She was admitted under the Faith Healing Program in 1933, the year the chapel's East Wing was reopened after a fire that no one remembers, and no insurance company ever acknowledged. According to intake records, Lillian was docile, compliant, and prayerful. She wept for hours in her bed, clutching a photograph of her daughter, Margaret. Nurses said she would whisper Psalm 6 every night like a mantra, "Have mercy on me, Lord, for I am faint." But then something changed. Rapidly. Over the course of 3 days, her hair turned gray. Her eyes dilated and stopped responding to light. She began speaking in fragments, Latin phrases no one taught her, and a guttural dialect that didn't match any known language. When her family visited, she didn't recognize them. Not even her child. She screamed when anyone brought up the name Elias. The final nurse to see her alive, Bridget Lowry, described the room smelling of wet copper and ozone, as if a thunderstorm had erupted inside the walls. Then came the official report, cardiac arrest. But when the family requested the body, there was a delay. Days. Then weeks. And when it was finally delivered to a private funeral home, something was missing. Her heart. The mortician's notes were never meant to be public. But a photocopy surfaced decades later in a whistleblower packet labeled STH anomalous cadavers. No evidence of surgical removal. Cavity completely smooth. Like it had never contained an organ at all. What does that even mean? A heart doesn't just vanish. Tissue doesn't seal itself. But if St. Thomas wasn't practicing medicine, then we're not talking about a surgical removal. We're talking about a ritual one. And what happens when you extract the one organ every ancient tradition calls the seat of the soul? You create something hollow. They say St. Thomas Hospital was founded in 1891, built to serve the poor, heal the wounded, and bring God's mercy through medical science. That's a lie. The original blueprints weren't filed with the city's health department. They were sealed inside the cornerstone during the hospital's consecration by a fringe sect of Jesuit offshoots known only as Ordo Sang Rio, translated, the Order of the Sacred Blood. This wasn't a hospital. It was a containment structure, a spiritual prism. Each wing was designed using geomantic alignment. Magnetic ley lines intersected precisely beneath Ward 3, where the 67 patients would later perish. The walls were laced with hematite and crushed quartz, not for structural strength, but to amplify frequency. You see, this wasn't about curing disease. It was about harvesting resonance, emotional energy, suffering, belief. And here's the kicker. Every major expansion of the hospital followed a ritual calendar. 1906, the year Halley's Comet was first tracked. 1929, start of global economic collapse, and again in 1966. The year of the beast, according to Masonic almanacs. Who funded it? You won't find their names on the donation plaques. But buried in an archived bank file labeled Lucerna Holdings, you'll find recurring wire transfers from something called the Gray Ledger Foundation. That group doesn't legally exist. No tax records. No employees. But its emblem, an eye weeping blood within a triangle, was later found engraved under the tiles in the nurse's prayer room, covered with a single phrase in Latin. Sanit per tenebris. He heals through darkness. Ask yourself, who builds a hospital to channel pain instead of relieve it? Who places a faith healing ward directly above a crypt with no burial records? And why do the oldest surviving blueprints label that area not as a recovery wing, but as the inversion room? St. Thomas was never meant to restore the body. It was meant to divide it from the soul and each patient. In 1348, they didn't just fight the plague, they hunted the souls it left behind. Screen cuts to black. One blood-red phrase appears. You were never meant to know this. Section 1. What if I told you that the Black Death, the most devastating pandemic in human history, wasn't just a disease, but a war? It started in the Alpine village of Valtina in northern Italy. The plague arrived, yes, but something else walked in its shadow. The villagers whispered of black eyes glowing in the dark, of children speaking in dead tongues, of corpses that didn't stay cold. The church sent no doctors, only one man. Father Aurelio di Castello, a Dominican inquisitor with no medical training, but centuries of forbidden knowledge at his fingertips. He wasn't there to treat the sick. He was there to seal something in, or maybe to seal out. By the time Aurelio arrived, 89 villagers were already dead, but none were buried. They lay in their homes, untouched. Why? Because no one would go near them. Not because of disease, but because the dead had started to whisper, loud enough for the walls to hear. Aurelio set to work. He didn't pray. He didn't bless. He drew symbols, circles that looked Roman but weren't. He burned incense with a smell locals said turned iron to rust and milk to blood. And then he entered the house of the Castellani family, where 6 corpses lay on the floor, their mouths still moving. He emerged 2 hours later, sobbing, not praying, not speaking, and the next morning, the entire village was ash. The records say it burned in an accidental fire, but there was no rain for weeks, no lightning, no fuel. Just bones, piled and blackened like sacrificial offering. The children in Ward 5 said they could hear the prayers, even after the mouths that spoke them had gone cold. That's the first line written in the nurse's log recovered from beneath the chapel floor of St. Thomas Hospital. It wasn't supposed to be found. The pages were stitched into the lining of a priest's robes buried in a sealed coffin, with his hands folded over a key that opened no door on the property. You've heard of haunted hospitals before. You've heard of faith healers. But what if I told you the real story? The one not even the Vatican would touch was about a design, an ancient layout modeled on something far older than medicine, built not to heal the body, but to fracture the soul. Brick by brick, St. Thomas was laid out like a liturgical machine. Every hallway, every stained glass window aligned with the solstices, the blood moons, the ancient feast days that predate Christianity itself. For years, 67 patients entered Ward 3 under faith healing supervision. None of them ever walked out. Officially, they died of complications, stroke, infection, unexplained seizures. But the coroner reports are full of redacted entries, burn marks, and something more disturbing, symbols drawn on the skin. Not carved, drawn, with ash, oil, or in one case, petrichor and wax. The head surgeon at the time, a man named Elias Corvin, was never licensed. No birth record, no death certificate, just one photograph, and it's not on the wall anymore. It's missing from the archives. But if you stare at the burn negative found behind the confession booth, you'll see 68 figures in the operating room, not 67. The story you're about to hear isn't just horror. It's not just mystery. It's revelation. And if you listen closely, by the end, you won't just know what happened at St. Thomas. You'll understand why it was allowed to happen. Because this wasn't a failure of faith or medicine. It was ritual disguised as mercy. And the ones who built it are still building today.